Spaceships are great, but what if you wanted a creature that can move through space without one? Let's sort it out. We'll start with the problem. Designing a creature that can move itself through space is tricky because it's very difficult to generate thrust out there without an engine. This is because what we call the vacuum of space is almost entirely devoid of matter and exerts extremely low pressure. What this means in practical terms is that there's very little to push against to get yourself going. Let's compare it to swimming. When you make the right motions with your arms and legs underwater, you're able to move forward because you're pushing the water back. Water is nice and dense, and you can feel that resistance you're working against when you're moving through it. But if you made those same movements outside the water, you'd find that they don't do much to move you through air. But why? Air has a much lower density than water, and what that means on a microscopic level is that particles are not nearly as closely packed. So it's not able to offer that same resistance to the forces you're exerting that allows you to be pushed in the opposite direction. In order to move in air, you'd need to have a body that's as lightweight as possible and with arms that are able to capture and push against a lot more air than human arms can. So on Earth we have birds and other creatures that are built to do just that and fly through the air like we swim through water. But the space in space is not filled with air, it's filled with extremely sparse particles of things like hydrogen and helium plasma. So if a bird tried those same movements in space, they'd have the same issues that we have above water. As much as they flapped their wings, the low density environment simply wouldn't offer enough resistance to get them anywhere. Also, they'd freeze and suffocate and probably expand a bit and ultimately die. But I'm not going to worry too much in this video about biological adaptations to get around that kind of death, because in this video we're focused on movement. I'm going to start with what I think is the most realistic and grounded option, which is to build your creature like a solar sail. So a solar sail works by reflecting sunlight. In the same way a traditional sail is pushed by wind, this sail is pushed by light bouncing off its surface. In order for this to work, your creature would need to be as lightweight as possible, with sails that extend many times wider than its main body. You'd probably also want it to be able to make adjustments in speed and direction. Maybe your creature has a muscular structure that allows it to change the angle and overall surface area of the wings, or maybe the wings themselves can change in opacity to alter the amount of light being reflected. When researching for this video, I was particularly inspired by the glasswing butterfly, which does just that but for camouflage. If you wanted to expand this idea even further, you could design a creature that's able to create elaborate patterns across its surface that it uses to communicate, since any communication that relies on sound would be ineffective out there. So let's talk pros and cons. This method of travel requires little to no energy from the creature itself. In theory, it could angle itself in a direction and then just let itself hibernate until some change in its environment cued it to wake up, either because it had arrived at its destination or it was time to change course. This is great because it allows our creature to embark on extremely long voyages and even be found in deep space. Since it's not reliant on fuel, the only thing it has to worry about running out of is whatever is required to keep its vital functions in order. Another pro of this method is that your creature can potentially reach some incredibly high speeds, because a star's constant light will keep it accelerating, and the extremely sparse particles in space will generate very little of the friction that would be necessary to slow it down. However, it will accelerate to those speeds very slowly, meaning that this is never going to be a creature that can just zip around, start and stop, and change direction readily. Also, since it's reliant on starlight as its primary means of propulsion, its ability to accelerate is limited by its distance from the source. As it gets further away, the push gets weaker and weaker until gradually it's non-existent, and over a very long time, the tiny amount of friction it's exposed to on its way would slow it down. You could reduce this limitation by having it fold up into a sharper shape once light reaches low enough levels. But if a critical error in its intended trajectory did leave it too far away from any new sources of light, it could end up stuck and there'd be very little it could do about it. Overall, this guy is great for long distance travel, but not so great for local travel, and that's where our next idea comes in. Build your creature like a balloon. I consider this to be the second silliest way to get through space for a couple of reasons, but what keeps it pretty reasonable is that it's loosely based on how rockets work and also somewhat inspired by the bombardier beetle. So we've talked about how in space you can't generate thrust just by pushing because there's virtually nothing to push against. However, you can create thrust by pushing something that's inside a capsule out of the capsule. As long as something is exiting your creature from one end, it will be moved in the other. So put simply, some sort of digestive process perhaps allows your creature to produce a controlled chemical reaction that creates a gas. That gas could be released immediately or expand internally until the creature is ready to push itself forward. Because of space's low pressure, gases expand rapidly. You've probably heard that if you try to hold your breath in space without a spacesuit, the expanding oxygen will basically rip your lungs apart. That means your creature probably doesn't need to be able to produce much gas to generate thrust. Keep in mind that if you want this emission to be less of an inert gas and more of an explosion, you'll need to be able to somehow introduce oxygen into the equation, since oxygen is required for combustion and isn't readily available in space like it is on Earth. One of the biggest pros of this method is that it allows your creature to move more abruptly and in a much more controlled way. If you want sharp changes in direction, all it needs to be able to do is precisely angle its emissions or be able to emit from several different directions. So unlike your solar sail creature, this guy is way more maneuverable. Another pro is that the exact chemical components involved, if you even want to get into that much detail, may require you to introduce some fictional elements, which is great because that means within reason, any limitations on speed and capacity are up to you as the author. A potential con is that this is a pretty undignified way to get around, as our creature is essentially farting its way through space. If you were trying to have this being taken seriously, it could be a bit challenging to get around that fact, both when thinking about readers and how in-universe human characters would react to its biology. But depending on the tone of your story, that may not be a problem. A more practical con is that this creature likely wouldn't have as easy a time traveling long distances as your solar sail creature, and may as a result be restricted to its own solar system. If you did want interstellar travel, you could have it do something like a huge burst of thrust and then a hibernation, but keep in mind that if your creature relies on something consumable to move, eventually that thing will run out. So if it travels between solar system, whatever it eats to fuel its movements needs to be something that's sort of universally available. The next idea I'm going to explore is giving your creature access to some sort of extra-dimensional travel, such as teleporting, wormholes, or space folding. This kind of writing is likely to be critiqued pretty heavily because our understanding of spatial and temporal dimensions is theoretical and evolving, and there are a lot of different models to describe what could be possible when it comes to bending our understanding of these dimensions. People are likely to react to your portrayal based on a very limited understanding of what you're talking about. However, I do think this makes this a great point in history to have fun with these ideas. Science fiction is not a place to worry about whether or not the information you're using might get disproven later. It's a place to be inspired by the possibilities science is exploring the edges of right now. The most important thing is that whatever rules you put into place to explain how your extra-dimensional travel works stay logically consistent within your universe. If they travel through some new dimension where space is more compact, think about ratios, relative sizes, what effect traveling between these two dimensions has on your creature and on space as a whole. Think about how your creature's form might change and what would happen if something else tried to travel the same way they did. Is it possible to re-enter normal space from a different angle, so to speak, and be unrecognizable? If there are naturally occurring rifts in space that your creature knows how to find, think about how they're detectable and how the rest of the universe interacts with them. Are those rifts being pulled along by the same forces that move galaxies, or do they stay in place while everything else moves around and through them? Do solar systems ever get pulled out of place because of them? Let me know if you want a longer video about these types of dimensions, because there's a lot of interesting stuff to explore, and it's a topic I always have a lot of fun thinking about. A pro of this mode of transportation is that it's basically magic. This gives you, as the author, a lot of freedom, and you can absolutely lean into not explaining too much because it's just beyond human comprehension. Just make sure that you have a good grasp of the rules you're working with, even if the characters you're writing don't, because readers will pick up on the inconsistencies even if you never precisely explain the logic you're working with, and your stories will be a lot richer if they feel like they could make sense. A great way to achieve this is to work in limitations. Maybe it's hard to travel short distances or to end up in precise locations. Maybe this method of travel is creating some sort of environmental crisis for the universe as a whole. A con of this method, aside from whatever limitations you decide to put into place, is that it can be hard to explain in a way that doesn't feel like a physics lecture. Because this is so at the edges of what the average person understands, it's difficult to hint at answers and expect your readers to sort of fill in the blanks like you can more easily with the previous two creatures, and you have to write a fine line between leaving your audience lost and leaving them bored. And finally, the silliest option for space travel that I want to explore in this video is just actual magic. Maybe your creature is in some sort of religious alignment with the creators of the universe, and those creators allow it to be exempt from certain physical limitations. Maybe you develop a system of spells that are effectively the universe's back-end cheat codes. Maybe you invent a mythical substance that just works, and who knows how. Like with interdimensional travel, this is going to feel good or bad to your readers based on how well you follow your own internal logic. If I were writing this story, I would consider combining magic with mathematics or biology to help the creatures feel a bit more grounded in reality. For example, we know that nothing in the universe is still, and we're constantly updating our understanding of how exactly it's moving. Maybe you write creatures that can just think where they want to be and then appear there, but if they don't accurately calculate their coordinates to account for that movement, they could end up accidentally stuck in the middle of a planet or trapped in a gravitational pull that's too strong to escape. Maybe whatever it uses to move puts a lot of stress on its body and causes it to deteriorate rapidly if it overuses its ability. Maybe it can break laws of physics that have to do with speed, but still has to be careful about how it enters and exits an atmosphere. The point is, your sci-fi setting can still feel very real, even if it contains magical elements, as long as you think through how they interact with existing physics. A couple other things to consider. I draw my creatures with eyes so they'd be fun to look at, but eyes are full of fluid and maybe not very practical for a creature that hangs out in a vacuum where fluids expand. Also, I kept this video focused on movement, but to build a creature that feels like it makes total sense, you're going to need to also think about how it stays pressurized, whether or not it can enter an atmosphere, and what keeps it safe when it's doing so. What senses make sense for it to have evolved to be as optimized for space as possible. For example, maybe it can't hear or smell, but it can see more wavelengths than we can. Think about its life cycle and how it feeds itself. Think about family units and social habits, and what draws its interest and informs its choices. Even if your creature isn't sentient, these will be relevant questions to consider. And finally, I am making headway toward qualifying for YouTube monetization, but in the meantime, I wanted to make it possible for viewers who are passionate about what we're building here to support it personally. So I've set up a Buy Me a Coffee, which is a bit like Patreon, but less focused on locking you into a subscription and more on creating a convenient place for one-time donations. So if you want to support this by buying me a coffee, check that out, and there are more great things coming in the future, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss them. Huge shout out to everyone who's on board already. You guys are amazing, and I'll see y'all in the next one.